Hi everybody, welcome back to the 9th episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by OpenTeams. My name is Henry Badgery, and today I was lucky enough to talk with Joseph Jacks, who is the founder of OSS Capital. OSS Capital is an investment firm that focuses on supporting and backing early-stage commercial open source software founders. He's also a founder of KubeCon, which is the de facto developer and user conference for Kubernetes. As one of the most well-known investors in the open source space, we were fortunate enough to talk with Joseph and ask him where he thinks the industry is heading and what he thinks it will look like in the coming decades. Some of the topics that we also dive deep into include: why did OSS Capital choose to focus on commercial open source software companies, something we also call COS companies? What factors does his company consider when investing in these COS startups? How is open source going to eat the entire technology stack all the way up to the application layer? Why commercial open source software is less of a zero-sum game than wholly proprietary software? And towards the end, Joseph provides a contrarian perspective to the long-lasting sustainability debate around open source. Joseph can be found on Twitter at asynchio. That's ASYNCHIO. This podcast is brought to you by OpenTeams, the open source services marketplace where users of open source software can find, vet, and contract with service providers. To show support for this podcast, it would be great if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts letting us know what you think, or a comment on our YouTube channel. You can also find a video version of this on YouTube, and please subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Now that the introductions are out of the way, let's dive right in. All right, Joseph, so thank you very much for joining us today on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've been super excited about this episode. I know your name has popped up. I've been in open source for just over a year now, and your name has popped up many times. And so really, really excited to have you on. So as the founder of Open Source Capital, and given you've got a lot of background in open source software, you're clearly very, very involved with the open source community. But what I'd like to know is, how did you get here? What is your evolution to get to where you are today? How did you go from an operator and founder to now being in venture capital?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm super fortunate and lucky to just follow curiosities over the years. And I early on, I think my second or third real job working in tech was a salesperson at a company called Talend, and they happened to be building an open source project for basically data integration, moving data between systems and applications. And it was a really interesting open source tool for programmers that worked in big companies and small companies. The company eventually built a product around that open source project and commercialized it. So I was actually helping them sell that product to enterprises. And then over the following couple of companies I worked at, I just sort of observed that when the open source kind of paradigm and movement is very central to how a company goes to market, builds their product, and innovates, really, it kind of changes everything inside the company. It makes the company live and breathe differently, if you will, if you sort of think about a company as an organism. And so I really just got incredibly lucky following that curiosity, and over the years have stayed as close as I can to this incredible open source community, which is really hard to pinpoint. I mean, open source is this kind of amorphous blob of people at many intersectional levels of interest, and it's an incredibly multifaceted, multidimensional sort of area in the technology world, but really fundamental to digital technology anyway. And over time, I believe also increasingly fundamental to physical technology. So really just kind of continue to follow my curiosity, and I just have continued to believe over the years that companies that are based on a core open source technology of some kind are really different, and they're so profoundly different, I think that they should really be sort of thought of and understood and studied from a different kind of lens, almost from sort of scratch on all the different dimensions, sort of how the company operates, how it constructs a business model, how it hires people, how it goes to market, how marketing works, how the company sells the product, how finance works, how strategy works. All these things kind of have to be almost reimagined. Maybe not from complete scratch, but really rethought critically. And yeah, so just kind of got super lucky, continuing to scratch at that curiosity. A number of years ago, I started blogging about kind of what general thoughts are in this area, and that sort of led to kind of getting convinced that being an investor in this area would make sense. And so, yeah, I'm kind of working on doing that for the last couple of years, and I'm pretty committed to doing that for the next probably couple decades. And yeah, just kind of working in that area is really satisfying and really fun.
That's great. And what do you think was the first thing that you noticed about open source? When were you just like, aha, this is big, this is a movement, I want to devote my career to this?
I mean, it's a really good question. I probably didn't have the, going to devote my career to this kind of moment until maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. But I'd say I learned about open source and really kind of understood how profound it was when I was working at Talend, the company I mentioned. So that, I guess that was about 10 years ago. But I think the reason open source is so interesting is that it's really just kind of an incredibly unique thing. And interestingly, it's actually quite hard to get any consensus on why open source is interesting across a large group of people. This is something I think about quite a lot, sort of just generally getting consensus and agreement across a large group of people, more than one, about why open source is interesting. It's actually pretty hard to accomplish because open source is different and interesting very contextually and kind of case specifically. So if you ask 20 people what their definition of open source is, you'll probably get 18 different definitions, right? So that's kind of the main thing that is just sort of the source of continuous curiosity and interest.
Okay. And I know, so since you're in the venture capital space, what have you seen? How have you seen the venture capital industry evolve around open source? How is their attitude changing towards open source? And what does that look like in the past few decades?
Wow, that's a big question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question, but I'm not really, sort of deeply knowledgeable about venture capital as people who've been working in it for decades are. I'm very new, sort of brand new, if you will. It's kind of a long, intense career is required to develop any, meaningful insights and wisdom about sort of venture capital overall, because the feedback cycles are very long. So you don't really know anything about a given action or a decision or a sort of perspective or point of view really until many years go by, right? And so I'm only starting to collect some feedback now on, thoughts and ideas. Maybe I had 5 or 6 years ago or something. But I think generally venture capital started off in the semiconductor world, where people were sort of really looking at the rise of computing and the critical ingredient to that being, the invention of the transistor and, basically optimizing the way chips are designed to make computers faster and more efficient and so on. And that was kind of, the origins of Sand Hill Road and venture capital, mostly focusing exclusively initially on semiconductor companies like Intel and others. I think over time, the industry sort of evolved away from really being exclusively sector focused to being more abstract. And so what that I think means is, venture capital is more understood as kind of a technology investor asset class where the money is invested into companies that are really just building quote unquote technology. What I think has happened abstractly, and I'm trying to give you the best like broad answer I can. It's such a huge question you asked, Henry.
It is a big question.
Trying to give you some constraint here on my answer and trying to be quick and concise. But the evolution from that kind of quote unquote investing in technology that I think has probably been the most sharp over the last maybe 20 years, which is definitely not representative of the whole history of venture capital, which kind of has its origins in the mid 50s and the early 60s. Has really been that most technology impact to the world and consumers, I believe, has been digital technology, not necessarily physical technology, but digital technology. So, and specifically, if you think about what does digital technology actually translate to, it means software. And so, software is the world of bits, zeros and ones. So we've seen over the last 20 years, from the rise of the internet to now, 20 years, 2 decades, just massive amount of innovation in the world of digital technology or in the world of software bits. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is open source has powered the vast majority of that innovation in terms of the digital technology innovation. What kind of underpins and drives that is code that was written by this open source developer ecosystem and community. And oftentimes people who really just did the development and engineering as a side effort, nights and weekends, kind of as a part-time thing. And this is really amazing because the sort of leverage that technology startup founders have gained in being able to go and sort of reach out into this amorphous blob that is the open source ecosystem is incredibly immeasurable. I mean, the fact that Google was able to leverage the LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, early on, of course, really every single compiler language, developer tool of that era also being really open source and freely available. And really, frankly, all of the huge internet companies leveraging that open source kind of propelled them forward really by probably decades in terms of the engineering efficiency and really, frankly, cost reduction that they otherwise would have had to bear up front in order to build all of that core infrastructure themselves. And so I think that the sort of venture capital perspective has kind of overlaid that recognition over time from being a sort of like subliminal, subconscious secondary observation to really increasingly being more at the forefront and increasingly being kind of front and center, a really critical item and an interesting kind of topic to dig into. So really, the last decade, 10 years, 2010 to 2020 is really when we've seen a massive like sort of magnification of this fundamental fact that all digital technology innovation is powered by open source. And we've really seen just a huge increasing upswing in really every major investor paying more attention to open source, how it works, what are the sort of levers that you can kind of, adjust and knobs that you can turn in order to make things work and optimize processes and so on. And how does open source development actually affect and drive innovation and so on? Because it's really a really unique movement, unique paradigm in the world, and it has a lot of complex nuances. So I think we've seen a lot of investors become curious and interested in open source as it relates to company building and startup building. What I've come to recognize is that in the world of startups, there's actually a different kind of startup, like a different animal, almost like a different species that has emerged over like really in terms of critical mass and in lots of examples, really just over the last 10 years, in the last decade. And what I call these companies, kind of doesn't matter. I think maybe over time we'll achieve some consensus here, but I call these companies commercial open source companies. Many investors, many folks out there call these companies quote unquote open source companies. And I have a bit of a semantic resistance to that because I think it's kind of oxymoronic to say that a company can be open source, which is fundamentally not possible. Yes. But I'd say in general, it really doesn't matter. What we've seen is companies like Elastic, Cloudera, MongoDB, Neo4j, JFrog, Fastly, Cloudera, I think I mentioned already, apologies, Confluent, HashiCorp. These companies kind of get formed from zero, essentially, a decade ago. And they are increasingly some of the fastest growing, most innovative digital technology companies on earth. collectively, what I've kind of been doing in the commercial open source level has been tracking and studying and trying to understand these companies with kind of an obsession and a deep curiosity for the better part of the last 6 or 7 years. Kind of as a founder and as a writer and just generally thinking about these things. And, this category, if you think of it as a category, as like a type of company, has grown from in value about $10 billion 2010, which is vastly the value of Red Hat, to now the category is valued at about 200 billion. So 20 times that number in 10 years. And not just one company that, represents majority of the value, which is Red Hat, but now we see more than almost almost 10 companies now that are worth each roughly $10 billion. So companies like Fastly and Mongo and Elastic and others, and actually more than 50 companies that are valued at more than $1 billion, which is really remarkable. Just the shift and the amount of time it's taken to really kind of see that change and transition in the world. Just 10 short years. So that's what I think has been more the sort of final piece to venture capital or just investors in general, not necessarily just venture capital, but also institutional investors, angel investors, individuals, like kind of across the whole investing spectrum. Pay attention to, at least in the context of digital technology innovation, which is really like majority of technology is as a tech sector, if you will. Being powered by open source, and it's being sort of viewed as less of a peripheral ancillary thing and more of a front and center critical thing. And I think that's just a really great evolution.
Definitely. I think it's also on the front of contributing back to open source and companies actually understanding that they need to pay for it. We see it as that free puppy, as I know it's very well known across the open source space. So is open core synonymous with commercial open source software?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's lots of semantics in this commercial open source ecosystem. It's kind of the area I focus in. At the same level of sort of semantic kind of fragmentation, if you will, in the open source and free software world. So the origins of open source trace back to Richard Stallman, the MIT AI lab, and in the 60s. Building out, or I apologize, I think it was in the 80s. My apologies. It was going a little bit too far back there.
Time.
1985, 1986 timeframe, I think it was, when Richard Stallman started this movement really with free software, the GNU license, the GNU GPL license, and the GNU and the GNU tool chain, which included things like operating system compiler tooling and so on that ultimately became the basis for Linux, and really the philosophical distinctions and differences between the free software movement and the open source movement still exist today, and there's a lot of terminology kind of fragmentation there. So when you say, is open core synonymous with commercial open source, I still think we're kind of figuring out how to articulate the different layers of kind of the terminology stack, if you will. So if you think about a startup or a technology product has a technology stack, I think we have a terminology stack that needs its own sort of fleshing out and figuring out and kind of understanding better. But for me, what I think open core refers to is not really a business model. I think it refers to more of like an architectural paradigm that is very pointed towards company building and towards kind of commercialization capitalism, right? Where you've got a company that's a for-profit company. And if that company has a kind of open core model, what's happening there is the company is based on a core open source technology. So at the core, the company has an open source core, and that technology, whether it's hardware or software, and can be commercialized or built or extended upon or contributed to by anyone without permission of that company. And that's a really incredibly fundamental thing, and it changes the structural dynamics and kind of the composition of that company really top to bottom. When I refer to commercial open source, What I'm thinking more about, again, for me in terminology, sort of I experiment with terminology quite a bit, but I think these two things are reasonably clear for me. When I think of commercial open source, or COSS, or this COSS kind of acronym, is I think of a category. And so I think of how SaaS 20 years ago was formed to describe companies that looked and felt like Salesforce, right? So you have companies that are offering their software as a service, and that changes the business model, that changes the distribution model, and so on of the company. When I think of commercial open source, I think of a specific type of company. So it's a sort of type of company, a category, as opposed to a specific model. So for me, the definition of commercial open source as a category refers to any company that fundamentally would not exist unless the core of that company depended on a core open source project of some kind. And it's usually one project. In some cases, it can be 2 or 3 projects, and that might even grow over time. But to summarize, commercial open source companies are companies, or any company, and you can certainly evolve into being a commercial open source company, or evolve out of being one. But it's a company that stakes its existence on the coexistence, the parallel coexistence of an open source project. So some examples would be Red Hat would not exist without Linux, Confluent would not exist without Kafka, Cloudera would not exist without Hadoop, Redis would not exist without the Redis Cache open source project. Say HashiCorp would not exist without Vagrant, and then now they have like a handful of projects, but it's still very much dependent on the coexistence of things like Vault and Terraform and a few other projects. GitLab and GitHub would not exist without Git. That one's a little bit more, say, confrontational or argumentative, but I still think the definition holds true there. Automatic would not exist without WordPress. So there's a very critical relationship between the company and that open source core. So for me, commercial open source refers to a type of company abstractly. It's not referring to a business model. It's not referring to anything else. And I think what open core refers to is a kind of architectural paradigm.
Okay, no, that was a great answer, and definitely makes more sense. I think that commercial open source seems much more of a broad category, like a bucket, and then open core is very specific. When you are looking at different companies, what are you looking for when you're actually investing in these COSS or commercial open source software startups?
I'm sort of first and foremost looking at the relationship between the company and the open source core. So, as a company pursuing this open core model, absolutely critical is the startup built by people who are interested in, building out a large company. That's another really critical thing. Some people are not interested in doing that. Another thing I look at is the project going to be very disruptive or very innovative in a given sector? It's another thing I think I look at quite closely. Another thing that I think is really critical is timing. So oftentimes you could build something that is timed really poorly, and this is indistinguishable from being completely wrong about the idea. So if the timing is like 3 years too early or 3 years too late on either side, it's really hard. I think a lot of people could argue that if you're 3 or 4 years too late and there's some competition, there's still opportunity to be successful. But I think in most cases, your timing has to be really, really spot on. Otherwise, it's just hard to build something that's going to really be meaningful and hugely successful. So those are kind of the combination of things I look at. I don't really have a magic bullet or a magic formula. Investing is like an incredibly suspect, speculative, artistic. It's really an artistic kind of process. It's in the eye of the beholder, I guess. And so the risk reward fundamentals are sort of reflective of that.
Mm-hmm. So if commercial open source software is any company that, say, relies on one core open source project, then what do you look for? Is it what impact does the community have, say, on the potential success of that startup? Do you look at the community? Is that a big factor that you consider when investing in the companies?
That's a really great question. It's not really a huge factor initially, but I think philosophically, my view is that, and this is something that I care deeply about, the most impactful open source technologies are ones that have enormous decentralized, distributed communities. So by decentralized, there's a lot of companies participating and individuals participating in the contribution process and how the roadmap evolves and so on. By distributed, I mean, it's not like one time zone or like one person or one entity doing most of the work. It's spread across. It's spread across lots of different entities in many different places. And so I think that that's kind of my belief system. In the context of company building, there are many different types of communities, and even in the context of just open source projects and the governance of open source projects, specifically, like there are many different types of communities. And so one of the beliefs that I have is that if you fix any hard constraint or like quote unquote rule in the sort of investing decision tree or matrix, you'll likely hamper or kind of handicap your potential. And the reason I say that is the number of exceptions to basically every rule that you can think about in the context of open source is pretty universal. So if you think of one or two rules where you go, oh, that's like not really representative of the quote unquote right way of doing things or the quote unquote wrong way of doing things, you're going to find an exception if you really dig deep enough. And in fact, maybe many exceptions. That's the main thing that I think kind of confuses a lot of people is you sort of look at the exception cases and they really challenge what I think happens when you sort of develop confirmation bias. There's lots of exceptions. But for me, the most successful commercial open source companies are obviously ones that build huge positive sum ecosystems, not zero sum ecosystems. And to do that, they have to have very large and successful communities. Having said that, there are many very large, extremely valuable commercial open source companies that have sort of kind of one-dimensional communities around their open source projects, which is to say, it's really only consumers, end users, and kind of partners using the technology. But the people driving the evolution of the technology, driving the roadmap, and contributing a lot to the open source project are the creators of the project and the people that are responsible for commercializing that project as well. So sort of, the creators and the commercializers kind of owning and driving the community around the project. There's absolutely nothing morally or ethically wrong with that. And we will invest in those companies as frequently and as passionately as we will invest in companies that are building projects that happen to be a lot more distributed and diverse in terms of the community adoption. I tend to believe that there is zero correlation between open source communities that are very diverse, distributed, multifaceted in terms of the contribution and or consumption with how and whether or not a given company around the open source core can be successful, or what the maximum success potential of that company could be. I find zero correlation between those two things. Maybe with further knowledge and insight and research and time spent here, my opinions will change over time. I'm sure they will at some level. But so far, I don't really see any correlation there. I guess to answer your question in summary, again, it's a really deep question. There are many different types of communities, many different types of governance model approaches, many different types of ecosystems. I don't necessarily think it helps anyone to discriminate and point at one different type of community and say that's a good community or a bad community. I don't think that it's helpful for anyone to sort of single out any specific type of community governance ecosystem approach in the context of open source or commercial open source. because I don't believe there's any right or wrong way to do things. There's just sort of effective and ineffective depending on what your goals are, and the sort of general path towards success tends to be building something that solves a really critical problem for a large number of people and being able to charge money for something at some level in a repeatable way. And so I tend to think that just introducing discrimination at any level, whether it's with a specific type of open source governance approach or foundation approach or what have you, tends to not be very helpful. I have a lot of opinions about governance models and commercialization approaches, but I don't tend to think that they're morally right or wrong. I think that it all depends on the context of how you hold a point of view. So is something effective or ineffective in the context of a goal that you have?
That makes a lot of sense. And it's, I guess, good to get that distinction too. So what are some of the current trends that you've seen in the open source space that you think enterprises should be aware of?
That's a great question. I mean, I think enterprises, like sort of thinking about banks and media and telco, insurance, obviously the internet ecosystem, tech companies, they should really think about how open source is really already transformative to their business and driving a massive amount of innovation at the digital technology level. So the world of bits and software. And I think that they should just acknowledge that and allow their employees, their software engineers, creators, product people to invest more time and energy in open source communities, certainly to contribute back, to build upon and consume open source technology as much as possible over proprietary alternatives, and to really just appreciate that the vast majority of the innovation happening in the world is really happening in the open source ecosystem.
I just wanted to know what you think are some of the biggest challenges today that companies are going to have when using open source software as part of their business.
I think some of the biggest challenges are really centered around kind of compliance and security as one category of challenges. And so there's a lot of vendors, tools, approaches, methodologies out there to solve for that. Companies like Sneak, the Linux Foundation, many other organizations help enterprises consume, audit, and comply with regulatory constraints and so on when consuming open source. I don't see that as a blocker or any kind of barrier for open source adoption. I think it's really just kind of the fundamental reality when you're dealing with large companies consuming technology. Mm-hmm. I think another factor is that open source can definitely be challenging if you don't have a bunch of executive alignment about what the fundamental benefits are. And so I believe one of the biggest sort of unrecognized challenges that large companies face mm-hmm. in sort of managing a relationship between their organization and the open source ecosystem overall is really one of executive alignment and sort of recognition that open source should be a more fundamental critical strategy as opposed to an afterthought and something that is viewed as sort of a free good and a commodity that is just kind of consumed and they move on. And so I think more organizations should have an explicit understanding of open source at the executive level, at the board level, at the C-suite level, and they should really get involved and embrace open source holistically, as opposed to having an open source program office that is sort of recognizing maybe some activities and kind of getting people on the same page, but not really doing anything extremely strategic. So I think that the strategic recognition of open source at the executive level in companies of all sizes should be more clearly understood. And I'm not really sure I'm seeing any organization drive that kind of education, with the exception of maybe the Linux Foundation. I think the Linux Foundation has done a really great job, and run by Jim Zemlin. So shout out to Jim, who's great. Educating enterprises about how to use and consume and partner with the open source ecosystem. But I think in general, those are probably the biggest challenges that I think kind of come to mind.
And that was a great answer. I definitely think that's consistent with a lot that I've heard in the past. And it's not, you can't just set up an open source program office and expect that that's going to I guess, see drive value of open source in your company. So one other thing I wanted to ask was, I know the core thesis of OSS Capital is that software eats everything. And I really, really love that, because software has eaten the world. It's eaten everything. It's taken over proprietary software. But what are the areas of software that have not necessarily been eaten by open source? What is actually still proprietary out there?
Yeah, so specifically, it's open source eats everything, which is a lot more abstract than what you said.
Open source eats everything, so yeah.
Yeah, I think open source has been really relegated to the world of software, mostly due to the sort of historic origins of the movement, going back to free software and, of course, open source in 1998, and sort of what most people think of when they think of open source, which is open source code. Source being a word that is often kind of applied to software source code, right? So, like reading the source programming language code of a given program of an application, and so I think really open source over many decades will really quote unquote eat everything. What I think we're seeing first and foremost is that open source is really eating software. And you know, Marc Andreessen has said, you know, a decade ago that software is eating the world. I think that's definitely true, but I think in parallel with that, open source is eating software. What happens next is open source is likely to eat many other things. It's likely to eat hardware. It's likely to eat the world of atoms, not just the world of bits. And so I think that's kind of an interesting progression.
Yeah.
What I don't think has happened yet, due to a few reasons, is open source really eating the entire technology stack or the entire technology ecosystem. Most of the open source progress and really the movement itself is kind of centered and concentrated around infrastructure tools and distributed systems. Obviously, it started off with programming languages and compilers and developer tools. But over time, we're starting to see a lot more open source activity at sort of middle levels of the stack, not necessarily just the lower levels of the stack, but sort of creeping up. And I think in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we'll probably see open source progress more toward the higher levels of the stack, kind of gradually going up and up and up and further towards applications. And so right now, most of the applications in the world, so things like things like Snowflake is actually a great example. A huge new IPO recently, the largest software IPO ever, large software as a service company, cloud computing company. Twilio, Salesforce, companies are increasingly betting on those kind of mission critical applications, and those applications are really proprietary at the core. What I think will happen in the next decade or so is the application level kind of slowly getting transitioned away from this closed core approach to an open core approach, where companies build on core open source technology that drives a lot of value creation for everyone. So it's positive sum as opposed to zero sum, and really a lot of freedom and transparency and choice. So open source innovation at the application level is probably where we've seen the least amount of innovation so far and disruption. I really strongly believe that's going to change rapidly over the next decade or so.
Okay, and since we're on the topic of sort of thinking about the future, and I know that you've got a lot of experience investing in commercial open source software companies, how do you see that area playing out? What are some of the significant differences to what we're actually seeing today? What is commercialization of open source software or commercial open source software going to look like in the future, and how is it different to what we're seeing today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that what we've seen today with the commercialization of open source over the last 20 plus years is indirect commercialization of open source, which is to say, Google and basically all the biggest technology companies in the world have essentially commercialized open source with very indirect methods and indirect business models. So, you kind of think of advertising as the dominant business model on the internet. I think over the next decade or so, what we're going to see is the shift towards the inverse, where instead of the indirect commercialization of open source, what we'll see is the direct commercialization of open source. And it might sound crazy. I don't really have any deep fixed point of view on where most of that direct commercialization is going to accrue or sort of aggregate or concentrate. I tend to think more heterogeneously. So I think that it's actually going to be very expansive and maybe many different approaches will work. You might see cryptocurrency, blockchain as one approach working really well. I personally focus on commercial open source companies, which is a for-profit entity building a product or service and selling that product or service to customers in as efficient way as possible and growing to a large position in a market that they create or that they're operating in. And in that context, the creators often of that company are also the creators of the open source project that the company is based on, which is really, really exciting and kind of fundamentally changes the capitalistic dynamic, right? And so if you think of the creator of Elastic, for example, Shai Banin created Elasticsearch, a decade or so prior to founding Elastic, the company. And he's created, I'd say, arguably hundreds of billions of dollars in value for the technology world by creating Elasticsearch, and really something that has just democratized this search functionality for application developers and companies globally. And that's really incredible. What he's also done in parallel, though, is created an enormous amount of value for his shareholders. And I think he's a billionaire, and he's created a huge amount of wealth for the employees of Elastic, all the stakeholders of that company. So I think that there's a lot of exciting potential in doing both value creation for the world at large and value creation for your company and your company shareholders with this commercial open source approach. And I believe very strongly that the commercialization sort of pendulum, or maybe that's the wrong metaphor. I'm trying to think of a better metaphor, but like the shift of commercialization will go away from indirect and more toward direct commercialization of open source, and that will just open up a really huge new market for entrepreneurs. And so this is really the main reason why I'm obsessed and interested in commercial open source companies, is because what happens is the access to growing wealth and creating value capture for shareholders, for yourself, in starting a commercial open source company really provides you with a lot of leverage as the creator. So I think that more open source creators should be educated about the fact that really, in a lot of cases, the most effective way for them to capture some of the value that they create is to become a founder of a commercial open source company based on the core open source project that they've created. And it's not possible in every case. A lot of open source creators in the long tail of the open source contributor creator community are working on projects that are really, you can't commercialize them directly inside of a company. So it's really not a huge population. But I think more people should be working on creating commercial open source companies from the open source ecosystem. So with that, I think that's going to basically change a bunch of the fundamentals about how companies are built and formed and scaled and so on over the next n number of years.
Okay, well, that's very exciting. It seems like it is a very positive future. And just a final question, I wanted to touch on something that I know is talked about a lot, and that is the issue of sustainability of open source. So do you think that there is a sustainability problem in open source software?
I actually don't think that there is a lot of precision in that question, which comes up quite frequently in the tech ecosystem and almost on a daily basis in the open source world. The reason I say that is when anyone might use the word sustainability, it's often in a very imprecise context. Which is to say that are you referring to open source sustainability in terms of why people are motivated to create open source, or why people are motivated to consume open source, or why open source is growing so rapidly? One of the things I've thought about pretty recently related to this question, not to sidetrack or deviate from answering your question, is a Peter Drucker sort of axiom. Peter Drucker is a famous business thought leader, and he's kind of famous for this quote that what cannot be measured cannot be improved. And I think open source overall really refutes that axiom completely. So sort of is the counter case to that in the following manner. So if you look at open source in the last 20 years, there is no single place that is completely representative of the growth of open source in terms of quantifiable measurement. However, in parallel, basically everyone would agree in the tech industry that open source has grown on almost every dimension over 20 years ago to now, exponentially and incredibly quickly. However, you can't really measure that growth, and so sort of refutes this Peter Drucker, sort of wisdom from the past, which is sort of hammered in the heads of MBA students, I think, and sort of you've got to measure something in order to be able to improve it. And I don't think that's necessarily true in all cases. But in terms of sustainability, which is kind of related to measurement and improving things, and how can something continue forward based on sort of understood set of inputs and set of outputs. I don't actually think that open source faces any kind of sustainability problem. What I do believe is there are a large number of open source maintainers and creators that get burnt out. There's a huge amount of disrespect, rudeness, and unfair behavior that happens on the part of creators between each other, and the part of consumers interacting with behaviors. And it's this very multidimensional sort of set of people that really you can find any type of behavior imaginable in that community. So what I do take a lot of I kind of resist the question, mostly because it's underdefined, and the context of that sustainability word is really lacking. That's kind of my general point of view on the question.
Okay, and that was a great way to wrap it up. So thank you so much for joining us, Joseph. It's been great talking with you, and I've definitely learned a lot.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Henry.
If you like what you listened to today, then please leave a comment or letting us know what you think. And that really helps out and supports the podcast. So thanks very much, everyone. Until next time, see you later.